Welcome to Win Games, Strategies for Success. Today we're looking at Heat, Pedal to the Metal. And as always, I'm going to assume that you already know how to play and you just want to know how to win. So the question in Heat is, how do you draft your cards and play your cards and spend your heat so that you are virtually unbeatable at the end of the game? And the answer is, you can't. This game has been meticulously balanced to create the perception of this dynamic position change, but in reality, what it costs to get ahead generally comes back to get you later. So in the end, the vast majority of the racers are all right there together at the finish, which is a great design. It makes it competitive, it's exciting races, but it means that the strategy question is really about understanding what you can realistically accomplish on each track and how you can give yourself the best chance of winning. So we can increase our chances, but there's no guarantees in Heat. Well, we're going to look at how to understand and quantify progress towards winning, because there's no points in this game, so what are we counting? How do we know if we've made progress? And then we're going to look at the tools that we have for affecting the outcomes and try to answer the question, how do we use those tools? And it's going to be pretty course specific. We're going to start with USA because this course, I think, demonstrates most succinctly the design that's going to make it difficult to get ahead, and it's also the one they recommend starting with. So when you're counting in Heat, what you win with is turns. And I don't mean curves on the track. I'll do my best to refer to those as curves. When I say turns, I mean player turns. The person who crosses the finish line in the fewest number of player turns wins. If you both cross in the same number of player turns, then it gets into distance. And that one's going to be a bit of a toss-up. You try to set yourself up well. I'm not sure if you can. So let's take a look at realistically how many player turns it takes to get around this track. And we're going to do it without heat. So assuming that you just have your standard upgrades in there and you're not spending any heat, what would it take to get around the track? And I'm going to mark these with stones for the first lap. And I call this heat-free or post-to-post racing. Right off the bat, you can get, let's say, 8 spaces to here. And I've added the stones here so that you can see after going 8, you go 7 to here. The longest stretch you can run in 4 cards with a standard deck with an upgrade of the 5 card gets you 17 spaces to here. The next turn you'd be here after going 3. Then you pull up to a turn, go around the turn, go around the straight, go around the turn, and that pattern follows itself throughout the board. So you end up with, it takes 8 player turns to get in position to cross the track. And then you can go, again, realistically, 17 spaces, which would put you about right here. And you're essentially going to do the same thing the second lap. After that one, you'll go 8, count that as your first, and you'll go 8 all the way around to here again. So you're at 16. On your 17th turn, you could cross the finish line. Now, it'd be really hard to do this. You'd have to have all the right cards at the right times. But 17 turns is as fast as you could go around the track without spending any heat. So then we ask the question, how could we accelerate this if we spent more heat? Well, I could spend a heat to get into 3rd gear and be closer to this turn. That's great. For what purpose? Well, then I'd be further around the turn. That's great. For what purpose? Well, I could then be easier to get to here, but in the end, you'd just end up right here. So as you look for places to get ahead, what you really need is 2 turns close to each other where you could effectively spend some heat. For example, if you were to overshoot this turn, maybe get a little slipstream and then pay a heat to get around this turn, instead of going 1, 2, 3 turns to be in view of the finish line, you could do it in 1, 2 turns. Here's the problem. It costs a lot of heat to do that. So the question then becomes, how much heat can you put into your deck without paralyzing yourself? And the general principle of this game is you spend the heat to gain, and then later on you find your ability to go 17 spaces and 7 and another 17 and then get down to 2nd gear for this turn is compromised. You can't do it. And that extra, I call these posts in post-to-post racing, that extra post you gained here, you then pay back here because it's going to take you 2 turns to set yourself up to get around this curve. And in general, I would say 3 heat. If you put 3 heat in your deck, you can still race reasonably effectively. If you put in a 4th heat, you're going to have a hard time, and at 5 or 6 heat, it's virtually impossible to even just to continue the post-to-post racing, which is what it's going to take in order to win the game. So the conclusion for the USA track is you would have a really hard time getting around in 17, even with spending heat. because of how the track is set up. It's possible, if the weather and the weather tiles pop up favorably, that you could do it in 16, but it's not realistic to think that you're going to be able to finish the USA track in less than 16 turns. So when you draft for this, you need to look at the fact that there's effectively three long stretches where you're going to want to be in third or fourth gear going a lot of spaces, and you're going to want to draft cards that, number one, don't cost you heat if you can, but number two, give you the ability to go a good distance. So a 5-1 brake would be excellent. A 4-wheel drive that gives you 3 boosts would be excellent. You need at least 2 high cards if you're even going to think about getting around this track in 17, possibly 16 player turns. Let's take a look at Italy next. Remember that Italy is 3 laps, and we see a lot of similarities. So heat-free racing involves the straight, the turn, straight, the turn, the straight, the turn. But then we have this huge straight here. And realistically, you're not going to go 35 spaces in a single player turn. So that's going to take 2 jumps to get around, and those 2 jumps are going to be fairly difficult. Remember, you only need to get to this spot in order to be able to make the first turn, and then you can recover in second gear through here. So with those 7 player turns to get yourself in position to cross the line, 3 times is 21 plus 22 to get across. That's what it would take to do this with heat-free racing. And on Italy, you actually have a better shot at doing that while maintaining heat. On USA, you're spending heat just to do post-to-post racing, but here you could maintain your heat a little better, which means towards the end you should be able to do something crazy through here, spend a bunch of heat, and then not have it come back to haunt you because you get across the line. So it's realistic, even in a bad weather or a bad draw situation with the tiles, to do 21 player turns on Italy, which means you're looking to, at some point on this series of turns, to jump ahead, to skip a post, to get ahead, and that's what we call progress. Progress means when it's going to be 1 fewer player turns than it would take heat-free racing. With reasonable weather, you could also do it in 20. What I would recommend is try to skip a turn somewhere in here, still get around in time, and then take the next lap to recover. Get the heat out of your engine, just do post-to-post racing, and then on the final lap, continue your recovery until here, blow the heat, and go home. So that would get you through in 20 turns. If everything looks really good, so we don't have any bad things going on, it's possible to do this in 19, where you skip once every turn, but that's challenging, in part because, and this is one of the principles that we're going to look at, it's much easier to race from behind. When you're behind, you potentially get the adrenaline, which gives you an extra space, which is not a big deal except that you get to control it, use it or not use it. And that's very helpful because you also then get to slipstream. And slipstreaming gets you along stretches with using less cards and puts you in position to make turns without having to pay heat for it. And that's what it takes in order to get 1 post ahead, or 1 player turn fewer in the total number of turns it takes to finish the track. So playing from behind is great, which means you don't always want to jump right out. You could go into third gear and get in the lead early, but all it would do is cost you heat. Well, I can cool the heat through here. Yes, you probably can, but what benefit did you give? You just got out front and let somebody else slipstream you, and they're going to get the extra spaces without paying the heat. So as often as possible, we do post-to-post racing because if people are being aggressive, it puts us in the back, and that gives us more control. They're going to have to pay for the heat they spent when they're unable to do it in a future lap. With regard to the draft on Italy, it's similar to USA. You want to get 2 cards that are high, that let you move a lot of spaces, 5 or maybe a 4 suspension, because we've got to get all the way around these. Yes, the turbos would be useful. I would take one on this, although I really don't like to take cards that have heat. But we've got to preserve that post-to-post racing, and we're going to have to do it 3 times. So if you see the 4-wheel drive, grab it. Turning over to Great Britain, things start to get a little bit different. We have an interesting sequence of curves here. Counting your heat-free or post-to-post racing, it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 turns to get yourself in a position to cross the line on the first lap. On the second lap, strictly speaking, if you only go 17 spaces, you're going to end up just shy of being able to make that turn. But that will continue to push you forward into each of the next spaces so that you're still able to get around the track in essentially the same number of player turns. And we'll finish with 17 total player turns to get all the way around the track. Because that last one gets us past, and then we cross on turn number 17. What this means for us is there's really only one really large straightaway where we're going to need to go 17 spaces, so I would only draft one high card, and then I would look for things that are going to help me do things within these curves here. So one of my favorite cards is the 2 suspension that allows you to reduce stress and you can put it right back on top of your deck. If you can get through stress, that really helps you with the hand management, and that's a huge piece in any race. I would almost always take that card. I also like to draft heat cards. Heat cards are great for giving you a little more versatility in what you can do. They go into your deck right away, and you can generally get rid of them on the first lap. So when you're racing Great Britain, 17 might be the heat-free racing. It is very realistic to do this in 15 turns. With just one slipstream or one heat, you should be able to take one post out of this turn section on each lap. Now, I would advise having one of those posts be the last because you want to push through as far as possible and be ahead when you come out at the very end. Definitely don't push it out fast, again, because you want to be slipstreaming through here. If you're the first one around this curve, it's really not that big of a deal. You're going to trade spaces with the other players, and everyone's going to get a chance to slipstream on the way through here. That should save you one post and get you to those 15 player turns to finish Great Britain. Another sneaky part of Great Britain you want to watch out for, this straightaway is really hard. It looks like, oh, it's only 17 spaces and then I have a 10 turn ahead of me, but if you start to slack at all during this portion, you're going to find yourself not set up very well for the curves. So you definitely want to save cards and play very effectively with your high cards. You're going to be challenged because, again, the last turn before the big open stretch is often a small one. So there's going to be some heat expenditures involved in that. This raises the question of how much heat is worth how many spaces. And the answer is it's never about spaces. It's always about picking up player turns or picking up a post. You should always spend a heat to gain a post if you can. There are very few situations where I can think of where you wouldn't spend a heat in order to get one player turn ahead in terms of the total number of turns it's going to take you to finish the race. Is it worth 2 heat? I would be careful doing that. There are certainly situations like this one where you're trying to gain 1 every turn, and if on the first lap 2 heat was the only way to do it, I would take it. I think that's a worthwhile risk. But I would not take that every time it's offered to me, because as soon as you get 4 or 5 heat in a deck when it shuffles through, it gets very difficult to maintain your post-to-post racing. And now the final course, France. This one's probably my favorite. If you take a look at what post-to-post or heat-free racing would look like, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 to get in a position to cross the line. Another 10 puts you back here. On the 21st, you would cross the line. So it would take 21 turns to race heat-free. But what I love about this course is for so many of the turns, if you're right up on the turn and then you go the curve speed, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it puts you in a position where 2 heat would let you skip to the next turn. So there are a whole lot of opportunities where for just 2 heat, you could be 1 post ahead. And that's exciting because slipstreaming gets you those 2 spaces, which means you can actually get 1 turn ahead for 0 heat if you can just manage to slipstream off one of these curves, and that'll put you in a position to, rather going straight curve, to take the curves consecutively. Whereas in Great Britain, the turns are essentially designed to be taken consecutively. These are just close enough that if you get ahead, you can do it. That means you can cheat 2 posts per lap on this, and it's very realistic to finish not in 21 turns, but in 17 turns. Now, the one catch with this that I would note there you don't see on the other courses is you almost never want to be in anything but second gear for that initial run because it's so easy to get within range of the first turn, and as long as you're post-to-post racing, there's no sense in spending heat to do it more. In this case, it's possible that you will not make it to this space, and that'll make it hard to get around that curve without spending heat. So depending what your opening hand is, if you can't get here, you might need to either boost or put it into 3rd gear to make sure that you can get across that first curve. It doesn't hurt you so much because you're going to be in 2nd gear for so much of this opening stretch that you will likely have turned your deck over and had a chance to cool that heat out before you get to, once again, the long straightaway. This straightaway is not too long, so when you're drafting for this, you still need your high card, but I would look for a heat, almost always. And again, anything that can get the stress out of your hand, because if you can get the stress free, that gives you more control over how you race. Curve speed limit increases are also particularly handy on this. A little bit on Great Britain as well, but on that one you're going curve to curve so often. This is a situation where having those extra spaces really can help you in quite a few of your turns. Another word about drafting, you want to avoid always getting things that move you a bunch of spaces. When you look at a card, ask yourself, how many places on the track would I want to have that card in my hand? If you draw a turbo first turn, you're going to sit on that for who knows how long. There's only one stretch in which it would really make a lot of sense to use a turbo. So don't draft a whole bunch of cards that you can only use in specific situations. Versatility is huge. Strategically, as far as where you spend the heat on France, anywhere that it gets you one post ahead would be great, but this curve here, curve number 3, and this curve here, curve number 5, are the places where I am actually looking to spend heat. Those are situations where, in this case, it would help me not only gain a post, but it would also help me get up into 3rd gear and be ready to go to 4th gear for the long stretch here. In this case, I'm coming off of a series of turns and I'm going into a stretch where I'm not going to be able to pick up a post, so I want to have done it by the time I get here. And if you can get 2 per lap, that'll give you 17 turns and give you the best chance at winning France. Okay, some final comments here on weather, on drafting, and on stress. The weather is kind of 60-40 as to whether the weather tiles help you or not. The tiles themselves, I mean, these are to your benefit, these ones are rough. If it's just rainy, you can usually work through those heat cards, unless it's USA in that opening set of turns. But if all things being equal, you're going to play the suggested number of player turns that we were shooting for. If things gravitate this way, so if things are really looking good, you can play aggressively, try to get maybe one more, or one fewer, I should say, player turn out. If things tend this way, you want to back off a bit and race more conservatively, because the people who don't are going to find themselves spinning out or stalling, filling up with heat, and not being able to play. When you're drafting, the cards that I don't like are ones that cost heat and ones that have the boost symbol on them. You just have so little control, and if you want to spend heat to go further, just boost. I mean, it's not hugely to your benefit unless you're getting a whole lot of spaces out of it. Cards with high cooling are also not huge for me, because that would require you to have that much heat in your engine, and we're trying to keep the heat that's in our deck down to a minimum. So cards I really like are the 1-5 breaks, because they give you that 5, let you go to 17 when you need it, but they're not useless elsewhere on the track. You've got the 1 there, or the 4 suspension, particularly if you're looking at USA or Italy, where you're going to need to go 17 spaces multiple times in short succession. That's a great card to have. This is one of my absolute favorites. On those turn sequences, frequently you can use a 2, you pop it right back on your deck and you're getting your stress out of your hand. It gives you complete control over what you're playing. And then it's nice to have a heat. I know it's counterintuitive, but it oftentimes, since it starts in your deck, gets in there where it can help you early, and you will really like it towards the end of the race when you have an extra heat. These cards down here are cards that I would draft, but they're not my favorite cards to draft. I find that +2 slipstream really requires you to focus in on it and make it hit to count, whereas these up here tend to be a little bit more versatile. Play from hand is great, because you can consider that to be added onto another number. So if it's a 3, that turns your 2 into a 5. That's great. If it's a 1 play from hand, I mean, then you're having to put it on a 4 to get a 5, and you already want to be using your 4s when you're trying to go long distance. I would also note that the one penalty I'm kind of okay taking is the trash cards penalty, where they flip right off the top of your deck into your discard. Because we play conservatively and we don't put a lot of heat in, we don't get punished as heavily by those. And oftentimes, especially on this 8, when you're trying to get back through to use those high cards again on Italy, that ends up working out to your advantage. And the final question we have to answer is, how are we going to work through this stress? It's problematic not to know how many spaces you're going to go on a particular turn. And the first answer to this is, unfortunately, card counting. And I know that sounds really kind of like a petty thing to be doing at a game table. But if you really want the best chance to win, it's hugely advantageous to you to know what cards are in there. Could this actually blow me up if I put this stress card down right now? And it's actually not as hard as you would think. The first time, you don't even have to think out at the beginning. You play your first hand, And then when you go to draw your second hand, you just look at what did I just put in my deck? What did I just draw? And that tells you the number of cards that are left. And I like to think of it in terms of kind of a shape. Like these are the cards that you might hit when you use the boost. And you think about what's left. Maybe it's 3 and 2 4s, and then 2 2s is what's left in. And I picture those two shapes, this top shape, which I would call a ledge, and this bottom one, which I would call a cloud. Or if it's all 4 of them, maybe it's a box or something like that. And you know what's left in your deck. Keep track from there on out. If you don't want to count cards, that's fine. Another way to get rid of your stress cards is using them on the straights, or using the garage cards that'll get the stress out of your hand. That's always advantageous. And the last thing is breaks. You can play this along with, say, a 2-4 break, and if you hit low, take the 4, and if you hit high, take the 2. So it's a useful reason to draft a break card, in addition to the fact that they can have some pretty good high values. All right, we're going to demo how the strategy would look on a few laps of Italy here. We'll start with a draft. We're yellow in the back, so we get to draft first. Remember, we need 2 high movement cards. We will take the turbocharger, not our favorite. But remember, we have to go a bunch of spaces twice in a row, so we'll save it until we have some heat that we can get back with that cooling. Second round of the draft, we pick last. Our opponents took the 3 best cards, which we've lowered there, and we are turning to our second objective, which is reducing stress. We'll take the 1-3 breaks. Last round, we pick first again, and we need another high movement card, but we can't afford to get one that costs us heat, because that would be counterproductive. So we'll take something with at least a 4 that could help us with our stress. So we will shuffle these 3 garage cards into our deck and then see what we get for the weather. The weather is taking 1 heat out of our engine, which is right in between a bad weather draw and an okay weather draw. We generally don't try to get to that bottom heat. But unfortunately, the tiles that flipped to benefit us, the weather and the free boost, came on stretches where they won't be useful. And the final turn before the straightaway drew the overheat tile, and we likely won't be able to burn that either. So strategically, we're going to play a little more conservatively. If we can get a post for 1 heat on lap 1, we'll take it. We will not push and take one for 2 heat on lap 1. And if we don't get one post on lap 1, then we'll look to pick one up on lap 2. If we get it on lap 1, we'll cool on lap 2. And the flag drops. We're on space 11. We've got to get to space 4. We need to move 7 spaces. I'm not willing to pay a heat and do the turbocharger, so we're going to play the 2 3s and see what everybody else does. Unfortunately, everybody went too far for us to slipstream. And in this situation, you would take your adrenaline, go the extra space, and get the slipstream, but suppose it was a 5 to 6 player race. We'll play it that way. This is a situation where you would pay the heat, and you'd take your boost, because you're going to have to pay another heat next turn to get around the corner. You might as well go as many spaces as you can with that heat this turn. I put the 3, 3, 4 in the discard pile. I draw a stress and a break. And there's a lot of ways that I could take this turn going 5 spaces. But anytime you have a stress in your hand, you want to ask yourself, is this a situation where I could safely play a stress? If I play the stress with my break this turn, the worst thing that could happen is I draw a 3 and have to go 4 spaces instead of 5. Well, that's no big deal. We're not counting spaces. I'd still be able to make the next post. So I'm going to do that and get rid of the stress. And green went 5 spaces. We land behind him and slipstream, which sets us up well for the next turn. Now we could go 4 spaces here, pay 2 heat, and pick up a post, but we're not doing that with the track the way it is, especially after paying that heat to boost at the beginning. We will go 3 spaces, and if blue stops just across the curve, we will take the slipstream, because 1 heat for a post is acceptable. And as it turned out he does, we've now picked up our post, and we can be a little bit more conservative in how we race. An ideal move over this next stretch would be 5 spaces, but 4 is also safe. We could still make the curve. We're always looking to play that stress. If we put it with a break, what's the worst that could happen? If a 4 came up, it could force us to go 6 spaces around the curve, which would cost us heat, but we've seen all our 4s, so this is a safe play. Our stress hits a 2. We go 4 spaces. We have the 1 and 2 in hand to safely make the next curve at a speed of 3, and that sets us up for the long open stretch. Let's take a look at what we have in our hands and what we have in our engine. We're about to roll our deck over. We're going to discard the 1 because we don't need it for the open stretch. We have 3 heat in our engine. 2 heat just came back up on our deck, and we drew them, which makes this a perfect time to play our turbocharger. Had we not drawn the heat in this hand, I would have held the turbocharger. It doesn't matter whether you play it on the first portion of the open stretch or the second portion, but you definitely want to get some of that heat back using the cooling. So we pay the heat to go to 4th gear, our stress hits a 1, we go 15 spaces, and then we have to decide if we want to boost. And it would be perfectly acceptable to do so. I am looking at the amount of heat I have in my discard and noting that I'm still 17 spaces away from making the curve. I'm going to save it, maybe boost next turn if I need to. Next turn, we're still in 4th gear, 4, 4, 3 stress. Our stress hits a 4, we're still not quite in range of the turn, so I'll boost, spend that heat, and that gets us in range of the curve. We've made it along the open stretch at the cost of some heat in 2 turns. One advantage of using all your high cards on the straights is that it leaves those low cards in your hand to take the next turn in 3rd gear, so you don't have to spend heat to shift down. And I'm going to run through the second lap of the race without the other cars just to look at what the cooling section might look like. Having just dropped 2 2s and a 1 to get around this curve and drawn 2 1s and a 2, I know the only thing in my deck are 3s and 4s, and I need to go 6 or 7 spaces. So this is a great time to play that stress. And indeed, I hit the 3, go 6 spaces, and I'm ready for the next turn. I have the low card still in my hand. We'll take that at 2 and continue to race heat-free. We cooled 1 along the previous stretch, and we'll cool 1 along this stretch as well. One of the advantages of a 7-card hand is that you can almost always have the cards you need for the next turn while playing what you need on this turn. Notice how we always have the numbers for the curve or the straight ahead while also taking care of the one that we're currently on. This only works, though, if you can keep the heat and the stress out of your hand. So we've cooled now, we have 4 heat in our engine, we have 1 in our deck that came back up into our hand, and we're ready to head out onto the straightaway with our turbocharger. Well, that wraps it up for Heat, Pedal to the Metal. Hopefully that'll help you win the game. Thanks for watching.